I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not sure I feel qualified to be the one sitting up here teaching this class, because my children are far and away too young for this topic. At least that's what I thought to begin with. Mine are 6 and 4 and will be here in August. So God willing, I have plenty of time before this becomes relevant. But this is something you begin at the beginning. This is a lesson you teach while they are young. So while I have a long way to go and a lot more to learn, I hope I've at least started the right way. So having said that, I am going to be picking your brains to learn more valuable lessons that I can take home with me, and maybe that way we can share with one another. So before we get to the fun part, let's take a minute and talk about the lesson text. Does anybody need a question sheet? There were some on the banister. Did everybody who wanted one get one? I'll take that as a yes because I see no hands. As I mentioned, Genesis 24 covers the question, or the story rather, of Rebekah being brought to Isaac. If you remember the story, excuse me, Abraham sent his servant to where? Where did Abraham send his servant? Back to his home, right? And what was his reasoning for that? Okay, he wanted him to find a wife, but why from there? Say again? Okay. Specifically, he said, I don't want him to marry anybody that's here where I am. Why? Idol worship, among many other things. The people of the land, as we find out later, are full of evil practices. Now, why would Abraham not want his son to marry a woman that was brought up in that worldview? Didn't have anything in common. Hold that thought. We'll come back to that in a minute. So instead of picking a wife for his son or letting him pick his own wife from the women around them, he sends them back home to get a wife from his own people. Now I have a question for you. Why is that any better than where they are now? Didn't God tell them to leave everything and get out of there? I don't know. Going back and looking at Laban, we see later, I'm not sure I would apply the term godly to that. Does anybody else have a thought? Okay. They're both right. While these people were not the most righteous individuals, being why God had told him to leave, they were far and away better than the Canaanites that they were around now. So they had more in common, at least in upbringing, than anybody he could find where they were. So who did Abraham send? His oldest servant. Now, I don't know that we find his name here, and I'm not sure we're told for certain anywhere else. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think we can surmise what his name might be. Anybody have a guess? Eliezer, right? Before Isaac came into the picture, this is the individual who we assume would be inheriting Abraham's estate when he passed. So he sends this man because he trusts him, right? He trusts him a great deal to pick out a wife for his son. But what did he make him promise?
That he wouldn't take Isaac with him.
He wouldn't take Isaac with him. But he also gives him a way out of the promise. He says, if you can't find a wife, you've done your duty. All I'm asking is that you go and look. So that answers number 4. He wasn't to bring him a wife at any cost. He had to find the right woman. So he makes the journey back to Abraham's homeland. And how did he know the right woman when he saw her? What process did he go through? Okay, she not only watered her own flocks, but she watered Eliezer's camels as well as Eliezer himself, which is correct. But I'm asking for a very specific thing here. How did Eliezer know that was the way this was going to happen? Okay, he prayed about it, right? And God answered that prayer. That's going to come back around in just a minute. So God was involved in this process from beginning to end. And that's a key point I want us to remember when we get down to our thought questions at the end of class. Right, William? I told him I was going to pick on him. He was giving me a hard time this morning. So Eliezer gets to Abraham's homeland. He finds Rebekah by this sign that God had promised. Now, before we go any further, what Rebekah did for Eliezer, was that normal? Would she have normally watered a stranger and his gathering of animals? Okay, fair enough. We may not know if it was abnormal for her, but it was definitely abnormal for society. Normally they would be looking out for their own interests, their own flocks, and worry about themselves. I think that's easy to say. It had to have been a unique occurrence. But what does this say about Rebekah herself? Kind, thoughtful, giving, selfless. Those all sound rather positive, don't they? It's almost like God understood the kind of man that Isaac needed. Come back to that in a moment as well. So, who was Isaac's wife? We've already answered that with Rebekah. And what was her family lineage? Okay, daughter of Bethuel, who was Milcah's son, who was Nahor, who was what in relation to Abraham? His brother, right? So, this is Abraham's family. This is exactly who Abraham sent his servant to find. Imagine that. God being involved and you find exactly who you needed to find.
But he was looking in the right place because he went to the city of Nahor. That's an important point.
You're not wrong.
God will send you what you need, but if you're looking in the right place.
Okay. just so it's said out loud. God will send us what we are looking for if we're looking for it in the right place. For those of you who might not have heard. So often we tend to, ask God to give us X, Y, and Z, and then we go look in absolutely the wrong places. And we get all woe is me, and God has abandoned me because I'm not where I need to be. That doesn't work, and it never has worked. So we have to remember with this topic, with whatever we are dealing with in life, you've got to look in the right place. You're absolutely right. That's an incredibly important point. So, how did Rebekah's family react to the servant's request? May not be the best word. Proposal, I suppose. They wanted to wait, but before that, what was their initial reaction? Take her, right? This is God's plan. God is involved. Let her go, right? And then they start saying, well, even though she's going, give us 10 days, whatever conditions they then proceed to try and put on things.
It's interesting that it says that Laban and Bethuel both responded or answered and said, this is God's plan, we can't speak one way or the other. Was it a cultural thing that the brother would have some say over who his sister was betrothed to at that time?
That's a really good question that I don't know the answer to. I would assume so, at least as far as maybe being the heir apparent, maybe. And we know it is cultural, at least that the fathers would be involved in this process. But as far as the brother being involved, I don't know if that would be normal or not. Does anybody else have a thought on that? Okay, he's introduced here, so we know who he is later. And that makes a good deal of sense. Because obviously, I guess, final say-so would fall to the father anyway. He's just being his normal self, as we see later in the book of Genesis. He wants to be involved in and have the say-so in a lot of things. So that may be all that is. I don't know.
Also, I see that we're doing it wrong. The engagement ring goes on the nose. According to this. Also a cultural thing maybe we don't understand.
So moving forward, I'm not going to touch that one. No, that again is probably a cultural thing. A lot of specifics like that would be, and I'm going to leave that right there. Okay. For those who may not have heard, is wondering if Abraham's riches have anything to do with their quick response. And I sing again, knowing the kind of man Laban turns out to be, that wouldn't surprise me at all. They always seem to be looking out for material gain. What do you think about that? I see a lot of heads going this way. I think that's probably another fair statement. And again, kind of a cultural norm for this part of the world is how much can we get for whoever we happen to have a hold of. Does that seem unfair? Y'all are quiet today. Well, we'll fix that problem here in just a minute. So, given the fact that her father and her brother were involved in working out some of the details of this arrangement, I guess it's fair to say Rebecca really didn't have a choice whether she was going to go or not. True or false? False, right? Even though they were all for the arrangement, she did get a say-so in whether she was going to go. And oddly enough, what was her response? I'll go, right? No ifs, ands, or buts about it. She's like, I'll go. I tend to think that's probably because she, like her family, realized God was involved in this process. And maybe she wanted to get away from her father and brother, but that's entirely speculation and just my wonderings. So she leaves and goes back to Canaan and back to Abraham's household. What does she do when they get there? Okay, she puts a veil on. Wants to be cool. Keep the sun off of her face. What? Don't shake your head at me. I am poking at you. I told you you're being too quiet this morning. Wants to be a little private. But what happens after that? Well, that comes very shortly hereafter. But she sees a man in the distance and is apparently enjoying what she saw and asks who it was and goes to him, and then immediately it seems that the wedding takes place thereafter. Here is where one would normally insert the joke about lighting off a camel. So consider that joke made and we'll move forward. I want to get to some of these discussion questions now. So the story is fairly straightforward. The servant is sent to find a wife. He does through God's intervention. He works out the details with her family and she comes home. What in the world does all of this have to do with preparing you and me to raise our children to look for godly spouses? I can be just as quiet as you can.
I think based on this example, we need to do everything we can in our power to make sure that our children are marrying somebody who's going to help them get to heaven. That's your goal.
Okay. We need to do everything in our power to make sure our children marry someone who will help them get to heaven. And I think that probably wraps the whole discussion up in a nutshell and really opens the door on this first discussion question. Because that's basically what Abraham did, right? He made all things possible to find Isaac a woman that was appropriate to that goal, right? He sent his most trusted servant, a large amount of wealth, way far back, all with that in mind. So Abraham, at least from what we know, is doing all that he can do. But what about Eliezer? What did he do in this scenario to help prepare? Okay, that's, I think, the key I want to talk about. It is prayer, right? You see that at least in the attitude of Abraham. It's something that he's done often. You don't always expect to see that in a servant. But the first thing he did when he got near to the place where he ought to be was he went to God, right? He told God, please help me find the woman I have been sent here to find. How often do we approach God in prayer in that manner. For ourselves, for those of us who are married, for our spouses, and in this context, for our children. Do we pray that way? Absolutely. And I hope we can all answer that way. Because if we don't, we've missed the whole point. Because Abraham did everything that he could do, and it still wasn't enough, right? Eleazar gets where he was going, and there's still a multitude of people he could have picked. Without God being involved in the process, what is the probability that he would have picked Rebekah over everybody else in this particular region? What do you think? Sir?
Probably wouldn't have,
Why not?
because he would have took it to do it on his own.
Right. He has his own set of criteria, right? Whatever they may be. I was about to ask why you chose Miss Susie as your bride.
Well, I really kind of did what the servant did. I really said that the next person I meet was going to be my wife. Even at a young age, so you get tired of this, that, and the dating scene and all of these things, and I was quite ready to settle down.
Yes. And you chose her over everybody else because of your own criteria, hopefully, and also involving God's criteria. I didn't want to put him too much on the hot seat. I think he made a fabulous choice. But it is different than, say, Jeremy's choice or Bobby's choice. Why? Because we are all different people, right? But what is the common denominator in their choices? They all married godly women. Now, this works in reverse, ladies. Hopefully, you are also looking for godly men. It's not a women-only club here, even though that's what our story is about. The choices we make, the people that we pursue in this area, all should fit the same criteria, and that's people who are trying to obey God. Now, how do we teach that to our kids? I told you my daughters are 6, almost 4, and not quite here yet. How do I teach that to a 6-year-old? Miss Andrews back there going, I don't know. Can you?
As somebody that's kind of in your boat as far as my kids are younger, not quite as young as yours, but we're getting to that point now with our older two that it's time to start really talking about that seriously. But with the example that my parents gave me, I think there are kind of 3 physical aspects to this. You talked about the spiritual as far as Abraham, having that mindset and making sure that that was involved. We've got to make sure that our children understand to look in the right place.
Yeah.
It's not enough that we understand that, but our children have to understand it. We have to impress upon them that you're going to find the quality of person, that's on the level of the quality of place you find it. I know a guy that had worked kind of adjacent to for a long time. He'd been through 3 or 4 different women, as far as long-term girlfriends, even engaged, and it never did work out. And he kind of bemoaned that. Why can't I find a good woman? Well, he found most of them in a bar or a situation like that. Well, no wonder. Not that there are not times, and there are plenty of great success stories about people who got together or were married that one of the spouses was not faithful and became faithful.
Sure.
But for our kids to understand, the priority is to find somebody whose God is their God and who is doing godly things
Camels.
Yeah,
Camels. I couldn't make an English word out of those syllables.
that we don't need to be looking at somebody as a spouse as far as, well, what are they bringing to the table? What do they have that's going to benefit me?
Sure. At least not
At least physically.
solely that.
Correct.
You know, it's not wrong to consider that partly,
Make
but
sure that you'll be financially stable, sure.
right.
I think Beth was hoping I'd have some camels to count eventually.
When camels show up at your house, I want to be there to see that.
I think it'll be goats and chickens.
But I think you've summed it up rather nicely. And you said, obviously, you need to be looking in the right place. You need to teach your children that love is something that is worked on daily. And that you don't look just at physical substance, right? I think those are fairly well thought out points. I think probably the first one is the hardest because, like you said, by the time children are here, hopefully that's already been taken care of for you and they don't see that on a daily basis. But the other two, I think it's important that your children see you living that. See you living the things that you want them to look for. Isn't that right, love?
And I know we talked about they're so little, but they see relationships, whether on TV or day to day, all the time. And just continuing those conversations just as much as God is most important at pointing them towards that of, well, if you're going to get married, you need to pick someone who's a Christian. You need to be looking towards that. Got the question out of the blue the other day. Is it okay to have a boyfriend? And I went, well, and so we had a conversation. She said, I just meant a boy who's a friend. And I was like, oh, okay. So, that's where our head is.
Good answer. Well done. But no, I mean, even at 2, I remember both of my girls. Anytime Alyssa and I would kiss, they go, "Oh, you're married! Yay!" And I'm like, "We've been married a while, baby, but yes, you're right." It's the fact that they understand that marriage relationship is something different and something special, and at least now it is something that they want at some point. You know, they don't understand what it is, but they understand it's something that they should be looking for. That's about as far as I've gotten in my own life right now. What about some of you who have children that are married? What did you do after that fact?
I tried to clean house.
How'd that go?
Didn't go.
Didn't go very well? And sometimes I guess it doesn't. Life doesn't always work out the way we would want it to or hope that it does. Unfortunately, that's just part of it. Any other thoughts or words of wisdom from those of you who are further down this path?
Probably backtracking just a little bit, but I was told 40 some odd years ago as a very young Christian, marry who you date.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's very true.
She didn't listen because she started dating me and I wasn't a Christian.
That was why I was told that. And I was will admit, I was blessed and it worked out wonderfully for us. But when our kids came along, it wasn't a question if they could marry, date outside the church. That was a rule in our house. That was our rule. And they all chose good, godly women. But, that was just, we weren't willing to take that chance.
Right. And that was a rule in our house as well, though there were some exceptions at times. But yeah, you're going to marry somebody you date, right? I know it sounds odd to say that, but if you only date good quality people, you're going to marry a good quality individual. It's pretty straightforward, in my opinion. You kind of limit your selection choice there. It's funny how we keep coming back to that point. It's almost like it's important. You got to keep looking in the right places. That's why even now we try and encourage with our children having friends that are good friends. You know, people who are going to be good and help reinforce positive things that we're trying to teach them. It doesn't always work out that way. You know, those Sexton boys are a little bit rough and tumble. I'm just picking at y'all.
All this preparation, all this prayer, and all the things you do to try and get just right, it doesn't always work out.
It doesn't. And that boils down to people are going to make their own choices. Right? The effort that we put into raising our children is important for us because we're going to be held accountable for that. But in the end, our children are their own people. And they're going to make their own choices and they're going to be held accountable for it. So all we can do as parents, and it's weird for me to be sitting here saying that because I don't feel old enough to be making this statement, but guess what? I am.
You're already doing the prep work.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it's my responsibility to do all that I can do. So here's another question. Sir?
The one who's conspicuously absent in all of this, Isaac's not mentioned until the end of the chapter. How old is he?
Do we know? I don't think we do.
Guess from chapter before when his mother died, he's around 40 years old.
Okay.
I don't imagine Abraham just all of a sudden springs this and says at the last moment, I'm going to send and get you a wife. I imagine it's been preparation and talking. Because at the end of the chapter, he's much like the father of the prodigal son. He's sitting and watching, waiting.
Yeah, he knows where Eliezer is going. He knows.
I don't think it's the last minute thing that he hasn't been talked to.
No, I don't think so either. This is something that has obviously been prepared for on either side. And again, it comes back to that. So, sir.
I know our society does it. They don't arrange marriages. A lot of times we look down on that in societies that do. But sometimes as a parent, don't we kind of wish we could.
Look, I thought it was ridiculous until I had my children. And I'm like, the longer I am alive and the older they get, the more I could get behind that system and enjoy it.
Isaac must have had great confidence in his father.
Yeah, that is a point that I hadn't gotten to yet. I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting, I hadn't noticed this until this time looking at it, chapter 25, following right on the heels of this. Abraham remarries after Sarah died. Well, there's not this whole, oh, I'm going to send back and get somebody else. And we don't know who this woman is. She obviously was somewhere around this. So just curious, is this a do as I say, not as I do moment? Or it's just odd, and I know we don't have all the answers to it, but it's just interesting that Abraham's wife's process here is just, and he got married, versus there's all this thought process that Isaac.
Well, I don't remember. Do we know any more about Keturah other than he's the woman she married next? Because I would like to assume that the same amount of thought he put into his son's wife, he put into his own. And I often wonder if she was a servant in his household that came from home or that had had enough time to come to a better understanding. I really don't know. But it is an interesting fact that Isaac is married and then Abraham marries again in the next chapter. So I want to ask this question, and I guess more for my own education than anything else. What do you think is the most important thing a parent can do to prepare their child for marriage?
Follow God's will.
Okay, follow God's will. Be good examples. Okay. Yes, sir.
There's two decisions made in life that are long lasting. Becoming a Christian, marrying a wife for life.
Yes.
Now, those two things are examples of how you live.
I agree. Brother Jim said that there are two decisions that follow you through life, and that's becoming a Christian first and foremost, and then who you choose to marry.
Now make a good choice.
I agree with you. Absolutely.
One thing, Jeremy, we talk about who they're looking for, which is very important.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to praise them to be the kind of person they need to be to make that marriage work.
You're absolutely right.
Somebody's looking for them.
Yeah, it's the other way around. You want them to be somebody worth looking for, right? You're absolutely right. And that's maybe a good way to come at this. You know, how do we raise our children to be those people who are sought after in a good way? You know, it's easy to be sought after for bad reasons, but for to be quality people, much less godly people. And I think it all boils down to you teach them to follow God, and most, if not all of these things are going to come after naturally.
Well, you gave us the example with the first man, Adam and Eve. That institute is even older than the institution of the church. Adam had a job before he got married. Adam walked with God before he had a wife. God set all these things up as an example for us to not only follow, but to teach our children. This is the way it's supposed to go, not looking at all the physical aspects, but he can provide a means of necessity for you and is willing to do that. Ephesians 5:19 and following. And how we should treat our wife and things of this nature. God gave us what we needed at the first marriage to follow. And the woman came from Adam, like kindred, from him, her family.
Right.
And these are the things that we should see for our children to do and for anyone. As a good example of why God told Abraham to go and get the wife from his kindred so they wouldn't be as unequally yoked when they came together.
Yes. Brother, that'll preach. That needs to be in your next sermon, I think. That's I got to stop thinking about that right now. I won't finish discussing class. So, anybody else? What's the most important thing you can teach your child? Or that you were taught if you were not in that position yet?
Chapter 18, as he's making the promise to Sarah about having a child, you get to verse 19, it says, I know him, that is Abraham, that he will command his children and his household after him, that they shall keep the way of the Lord. And so the preparation goes in initially as far as the spiritual aspect.
Right, right. Again, that they will follow the way of the Lord. This is the theme that we see repeated over and over again.
I think the most important thing you can teach your child is not just prayer, but waiting on God's time.
What do you mean?
Not trying to, as a young man, I tried to force that to happen. I wanted that relationship. It was the worst relationship of my entire life. And then after that point, I said, unlike you, I said I was completely finished with it. I said I want nothing more. This is what it's like, and I want nothing more to do with it. And then
Yes.
I
Yeah.
think the point there is that you've got to wait on God's time. He's gonna put that person in front of you.
Sometimes hit you over the head with it.
Sometimes it will hit you smooth in the face, but don't try to force your will into God.
And I think that is a very valuable lesson, and I find it a little bit ironic given the fact that we're looking at Abraham here. He didn't learn that lesson either until much later in life. But I think,
I know a lot of people that got married because they got to be a certain age, and it was they thought it was time for them to get married, so I'm just gonna go get married.
right,
And a lot of times that doesn't work out very well.
yeah, because, well, that wasn't the right time really for them, even though they thought that, or the right individual. No, you're right. There's a lot of, and I guess that's a good lesson too, is don't put artificial timetables on things, where we can be bad about that in our own lives, much less our children's lives. That we're not all on the same calendar, I guess. Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
That's something I try and think about when we have conversations, because not everybody gets married, or at least not everybody is yet seeing that happen, you know? So I think it's important to talk to our kids, not about when they get married, but if they get married, and not necessarily put that pressure on them.
Yeah.
Okay, you know, when's this gonna happen kind of thing, but for them to be ready for their own purposes, for God's purposes, and then all those other things will fall into place too.
I think that's a good piece of advice as well, is, if not when. And I think you see Paul kind of teaching that too. He says, if you marry, because it opens up a whole nother level of responsibility that, I hate to use the word hampers your ability to do God's work, because that's not quite right, but it changes focuses a little bit. They're already counting, and I'm not done. I want to ask this last question. What is the most important lesson that you have learned that you would pass on to somebody who is thinking about getting married?
I would say this: choose wisely, and it will help you the rest of your life. Choose wrongly, and you're in worldly trouble. Because, all these lessons we've been going over, the ones you're still to come, the one I'm going to teach you a week from now, the foundation of all of them is if you have a good spouse, whether you're, whichever sex you are, if you have a good spouse, then problems can be overcome.
Yeah.
If you don't, then that's just going to compound anything you
It
face.
just makes it that much worse, right? And you're right. This will either be the best choice or the worst choice you ever make. That's the bell, but I don't want to cut it off right there. Does anybody else have something they would like to share? All right. We'll turn you loose. Thank you so much for your participation.